through. Down her wild mountains and canyons she flew, Canadian Northwest to the ocean so blue. So roll on, Columbia, roll on. And up on the river is Grand Kootenay Dam, the mightiest thing ever built by a man, to run the great factories and water the land. So roll on, Columbia, roll on.
Okay, we're singing this song because we all know Woody Guthrie is like a progressive person, a mythological character. A person stands up for the little people, and Columbia River Treaty on this side of the border is kind of not so cool. So wrap your head around the fact that the person who stood, the person who stands for us, celebrated wiping out of the salmon, the biggest borrowing in the history of the country, the largest cement structure you ever had, and the employment of the people. In those days, giving people water to grow food and a job was seen as a good thing. Gretchen's daughter had immigrated to Canada with her husband and 4 children. She now was a Canadian, and one day I was lucky to be down the road from my house visiting Gretchen's family when her mom Roma came, and a conversation began. I don't really remember how it happened. We were all having tea. And Gretchen somehow began to tell the story of her friends who lived on the Arrow Lakes, like around Edgewood, and how it had come to pass that their farm was burned out, and they left with almost no money, and had they were essentially evicted and burned out and paid a pittance, and it all had to do with some kind of deal called the Columbia River Treaty. Gretchen told about the farms and homes and the stores and the cemeteries that had been buried with water, and the whole communities moved. First Nations cemeteries, communities buried with water. The cemetery in the lower Arrow Lakes that they covered with cement because they didn't want the bodies to float. The churches that were burned out. 2,300 people burned and bulldozed out of the way to accommodate something that Gretchen called the Columbia River Treaty. And then she told about the lies. There, people were told, oh, it's going to be so cool here. There's going to, instead of this river going up in the spring and down in the fall and everything, we're going to build you a lake. We're going to make it so you can go walk outside every day, go swimming. People will come, tourists come from Eastern Canada. You're going to have a beautiful future, and because you got to be able to get over to the Okanagan and travel around, we're going to build bridges across the Arrow Lake so that you can travel from Edgewood to Folke, or Folke on the other side. Or we're going to make it like the Okanagan Lake at least. And Gretchen told me what people actually got, which was a reservoir, a bathtub. And when the water goes down, dust blows and buries Revelstoke. Dead water. Like before, you know how lakes work in the spring, the freshet comes down and all the nutrients go into the lake, and the nutrients feed little stuff, and the fish eat the little stuff, and then the bigger fish come, and that makes the lake alive. And when you build a dam, nutrients go to the bottom of the dam, and you get essentially a desert behind the dam. You get dead water, you get dead biology. In Valemont, when the reservoir is full, you can see the water from the town, and then when they draw it down, it's 20 miles. You might own a boat in your driveway, but it's 20 miles of mud flats to the water. Gretchen's telling this story, and she's angry. She told Mom about how the reservoir at Duncan, they were in a hurry. They had a deal. They had to get this dam built by 1968, and the earthen dam at Meadow Creek, and so they don't have time to log the valley, so they just built the dam. Well, miles and miles and miles of dead spruce trees and cottonwood trees and cedar, like a pincushion forest in a lake. In Libby, Montana, the treaty said you could build, the Americans could build a dam at Libby, but it also said that that dam could back up 42 miles of Canada. Gretchen was on a roll, but she was drunk, and she was kind of yelling at her mom. And then Gretchen sang her mom a verse of another song. You got another song? Okay, so this is a Canadian part of Act 1. This is called The Dam Song. It was written by Skip Fraser and Joe Irving of Castlegar, BC. And once upon a time, back in the 60s, when people were talking about this stuff, it's kind of a famous song. Okay, so this is kind of to the tune of This Land Is Your Land. I'm not real sure how to do that, but okay, so, you know This Land Is Your Land?
This land is your land.
There's 7 wonders in this world, their names are known quite well. From Babylon gardens to the Sphinx, their ancient stories tell. But now the greatest wonder is the folly in our land. They sold us down the river with the new high arrow dam. 4 miles up from Castlegar, the Columbia will be dammed. And the water that they store there, controlled by Uncle Sam. This sets my mind to wondering just what the fate will be of the big Columbia River from the Rockies of BC. It's not that we're ungrateful, we've never been before. Been trying to stand up on our own since 1864. But now upon this issue, we all must take a stand. Canada for Canadians, it's our God-given land. Is this land our land, or is it their land? This land was made for you and me. Yeah, Roma was hurt by her daughter's anger and her daughter's song. The dams and the treaty had saved Roma's family, had saved the farm, had made it so they had a life. The grandchildren visited them there on the farm. They built a community. And Roma told them how the irrigation works and how they can grow beets and make a living. And when the 2 women were done, there was tears and residual anger and no solution, no resolution. I didn't think either one could understand the position of the other. I was just sitting in the corner. I was witnessing my tea. It ended more with a truce, I'd say, than an understanding, which is understandable given the huge complexity of the issue and how it's seen on both sides of the border. I want to explain how it kind of comes to pass that it was so different on both sides of the border. Roosevelt was trying to develop irrigation and rural electrification. 1929, 1930, the Dust Bowl, kind of remember that. And then what happened in history, we came to World War II. And you didn't have to make jobs. You had to build airplanes and guns and bullets and ships and tanks and stuff like that. And the Pacific Northwest became sort of an industrialized center, and aluminum started being made there. And aluminum takes huge amounts of electricity, and they were making, by the end of the war, 40% of the electricity in the United States. And then a secret project started there that used massive amounts of electricity. Nobody knew what it was called. It didn't really matter. It was a secret. You know now, actually, it's called Hanford. So electricity began to be the currency, not irrigation. The currency of value. I should explain a little bit about how electricity works. Electricity is pretty much worthless at 2 o'clock in the morning because we're all asleep and the factories are all closed, and it's pretty much low value in the spring and in the fall because we don't have to heat our homes or cool them. In the summertime when it's hot in LA, the price of electricity goes up. Everybody has air conditioners. They're living in a desert, right? And in the wintertime in Portland, everybody has a heater and their electricity goes up. Spring and fall isn't worth very much. 2 o'clock in the morning, it isn't worth very much, but it's worth a whole whack if you can save it until January. And it's worth a great deal of money at 6 o'clock when you get home from work and turn on the oven. Everybody, right? That's called peak. Like, we all need electricity. So that moment has this huge value in the rest of the day is next to nothing. So the United States are going, oh, now let's see, we need a big amount of electricity, but we need it when we want it. We don't really want it running down the river in springtime when God melts the snow and it all runs out to sea. It's useless to us. What's that say? Half gone. Okay. So in order to make the electricity be worth something, we need a way to stop that water. So that when we want it, it'll run down the river, go through our turbines, make electricity, we can sell it and make some money and make aluminum and build this secret in Hanford and heat everybody's homes in Portland and cool them off in LA, and we'll make lots of money. The Columbia in the United States is kind of flat. You guys have been there? Like, you can't make electricity on a flat river. Like, there's way bigger rivers like the Amazon or the Mississippi or something like that, but they're running across flat land. And so that isn't worth all that much. You can make electricity where there's drop, where the water starts up here and ends down here. So you can make it go downhill, build a dam, and then drop the water and it goes through the turbine. That makes sense? Get that? Well, Canada, I mean, Columbia made a lot of salmon, but what it really has is drop. Columbia drops, it runs 1,200 miles. But in that 1,200 miles, it drops almost 3,000 feet, which is different than almost everybody else. And most of that drop is in Canada. So now here are these people, and they're trying to figure out how can we stop the water so at 6 o'clock we can run it through our turbines and it makes it. Well, let's stop the water in Canada and make the power in the United States. So in the 1940s, following the war, secret discussions began to happen and secret negotiations, and surveyors showed up in Castlegar and certainly in Revelstoke, and they're looking around and nobody's really too sure what they're doing there, but they're looking for a place to build the bathtub to store the water. And it's kind of cool, you own a little hotel, you're renting it to a bunch of guys from Texas who are surveying, but won't tell you what they're doing, but you're making money with your hotel. And gossip began. But it's a secret for the 1940s, and then in 1948 a miracle happened, a miracle for those people, and that was whacking huge amounts of snow, rain on snow, and a flood, which ripped out parts of Trail and every other little town from here to Portland, flooded part of Portland, people died, and a flood, it's like a wildfire, it's a disaster, and everybody goes, oh, let's solve this problem. Oh, I know, we could solve the flooding problem by stopping the water. Never mind the fact that we only thought it up in order to make money, but we could save lives by stopping the water. So in 1948, Canada and the United States said, oh, we're going to think about solving the flood issue by building some dams. And people, oh, safe trail. So all through the 1950s, there was a not secret but open discussion about where to build the walls, the dams, to stop the water in Canada. And of course, the Air Lakes became the center of a lot of that conversation. And when, like, you know how your house price is valued. If somebody's going to build a strip joint next door, your land value goes down, right? It's way worse with farmland. If somebody's going to flood your land, it becomes incredibly difficult to sell it. So all through the 1950s, the land prices in the Kootenays collapsed while the public debate about whether or not to flood land carries on. And it's a very public debate. Elections were fought by Bert Harridge and others right here in this town, against the treaty or for the treaty, the proposed treaty, the idea of a treaty. And in 1964, Lyndon Johnson and Lester Pearson and W.A.C. Bennett, they signed a deal that said that Canada would hold back 15.5 million acre-feet of water to be delivered on demand to the United States. The authority in charge of holding the water would be called BC Hydro. BC Hydro didn't exist until 1964. W.A.C. Bennett wiped out all of the private electrical companies in British Columbia with a program called nationalization, except West Kootenay, and created BC Hydro Authority and gave it the power in law to burn out your house. And the deal, you know what an acre foot is? It's 1 cubic foot of water covering 1 acre of land. 15 million acre feet meant we were going to build 3 dams. We're going to build the Mica, the Duncan, the High Arrow, and we were going to let Americans build the Libyan flood 42 miles of land in Canada. And we had to get it all done in 68, 69 because there was a timetable attached to it. And the treaty said, this is really complicated. I'll do it as fast as I can. The treaty said Canada would be paid for a thing called downstream benefits. What downstream benefits are, okay, we talked about the price of power. So Canada's going to hold the water until the price goes up, right? So mathematicians will calculate the value of the water on the day Canada stores it, and the value of the water on the day the Americans ask for it. So if the water is stored in spring when value is low, and then released in summer when the value is high, that difference in value will be called the benefit, right? The downstream benefit. The treaty said that for the first 30 years of the treaty, the Americans would give you, Canada, $264 million, which W.A.C. Bennett spent building 3 dams here and the Peace River. And probably spent way more. Anyway, in those days, remember, this is before the 6 Days War. This is before the Arab oil embargo. This is before the era where electricity became the valued currency of our time. We sold the first 30 years for $364 million, which was a pittance. And the treaty said the treaty will run for 60 years, 1964 plus 60. But America will pay us for the first 30 years $264 million, and whatever the downstream benefits are, half the value of that increased dollar value of the second 30 years, that will be determined after 30 years. So Canada proceeded, BC Hydro, to burn out 2,300 people, to build 3 dams. And Roma and her family were living on the American side and actually farming and making money for the first time in their life, and Gretchen and her children who were living on the Canadian side. And telling the story and experiencing not, oh look, we made all these jobs, oh look, we come, but what the hell happened where we live? We didn't even make power. Understand that. We are building bathtubs. The Duncan Dam makes not a single kilowatt. The High Arrow Dam that Skip and Joe were singing about is a drone. I'm a beekeeper. You know what a drone is? It has no function whatsoever except reproduction. And then you kill it in winter. Like, the High Arrow Dam stops water. It was never intended to do anything for you. Gretchen's telling this story feeling like the United States Army Corps of Engineers is now the authority over her life. So that's the tension these 2 women who we're talking about that ended Act 2. Act 1 happened, some good ideas, employ some people, try and get out of the depression, make farming viable. Act 2, flood Canada to make money. But then it began to evolve. One person who I would nominate as a hero of Act 2 was the first person who began to understand all this and explain it to me. A long time ago when I was young, I was the regional district director for the Spokane Valley. Regional district director is kind of like, I don't know, the mayor or something. And the recreation coordinator for the Spokane Valley was a woman named Zena Padmos, and one day she said, "Well, I come see her," and I went to see her, and she said, "Corky, the people who play softball at the Winlaw playing field want us to replace the grass because it's all worn out and they're falling down on the dirt." And I said, "Well, I don't have any money." Zena, you got any money? She goes, "No, I don't have any money in my budget. We can't." And I said, "Well, why don't we have any money? Like, what's really going on?" Because you can get elected and still be ignorant. I don't know if you know. And I had no idea why we didn't have enough money for grass so you could play softball. And this woman explained to me Order in Council 1021 that said, passed by British Columbia in the 1960s, it said, BC Hydro will be exempt from taxes on the Peace River and on the Columbia River and will not have to pay grants in lieu or anything else. It is free for BC Hydro to operate on the Columbia system and on the Peace system. And Zena explained to me that the brand new canal project at South Slocum, that big facility that diverts the Kootenay, was worth more than all the homes and mines and factories and sawmills in the Spokane Valley combined and paid zero. And that's why we didn't have any money to plant grass, because the largest taxpayer in the region was exempted from paying any taxes. That seemed really stupid to Zena and to me, and a bunch of stuff happened after that. We decided to have a referendum, and the next election asked people, yes or no, do you think BC Hydro should pay taxes? And surprisingly, all the people thought, like, I've been to lots of elections, 50% is a great number. Here we got like 93 or something. There's 6 really grumpy people who said no or something. Anyway, so then the regional district of Central Kootenay got together with other regional districts and began to talk about, like, how did it come to pass that for 30 years, hydro's been exempt in our territory? And one thing kind of led to another. The idea that we had been mistreated in law as well as physically with the flooding of valleys was a new idea in the 1980s. And as regional districts and municipalities talked about it, the parochialism where Revelstoke always fights Castlegar and Castlegar hates Nelson and Nelson hates Trail, and we all grew up playing hockey and we'd go fight. Like, we saw the enemy as each other. But in the 1980s, conversations were happening between municipalities and regional districts about, oh, you're getting screwed and I'm getting screwed too. How does that come to pass? Like, what? And parochialism began to follow in. There was a bit of a dialogue happening. And then the most magical thing happened about 1990, 91 or something like that. The regional districts realized that if they were going to talk about the Columbia River Treaty at BC Hydro, they ought to also involve maybe the tribal council, how the native people, like the story is that when the Tanaka people went down to the Columbia after the Grand Coulee was built to fish that year, it's been done for 2,000 years, there was no fish, because of course there's no fish ladder, and the Canadian government sent them canned salmon to see if they could get through the winter. So the regional districts were now talking with the tribal council, and then a whole bunch of amazing things happened really fast. The first was the dialogue. The second was somebody woke up to the fact that In 1991, we were just 3 years away from the ending of the first 30-year deal, the $264 million. And somebody was going to get to renegotiate what really is half the downstream benefits value. What's that electricity worth for the next 30 years? The third thing that happened at the time was an election of a provincial government, the first provincial government, almost since the 60s, with the exception of 3 years. The first provincial government was elected that hadn't been signatory to the treaty, so did not have to defend the deal. I'm not saying they were any better, but they weren't in a defensive posture. The next thing that happened that was truly amazing, has never happened before and probably never happen again, is that all 5 MLAs representing parts of the basin from Valemont to Trail were elected from the same political party, and the political party happened to be the government. The next really cool thing that happened, and I know it doesn't sound that nice, but the next really good thing that happened was that the price of lead and zinc crashed, which has nothing to do with anything except that Comingo was broke. And maybe for the first time in Comingo's history, Comingo's pretty powerful. Pretty much always been able to do anything that they wanted to, whomever they wanted. First time in history, Comingo actually had to ask for help from people. And they began to sell assets. First they sold West Kootenay Power, and then they were selling land. And then they thought, okay, we have to lower our prices, we have to figure out how to make lead and zinc cheaper, so we'll build a brand new modern smelter, and they built one that they designed themselves, and it warped. And it wouldn't go around, and it would stop. Hundreds and hundreds of millions. So Comingo was up against the wall. The light went on in a whole bunch of people's heads and thought maybe because all these bizarre things have happened, this would be the moment to have a dialogue. And for 2 years, people from the Kootenays, East Kootenay, all the way to Golden and the West Kootenay and up to Valemont, got together, Castlegar and Revelstoke, for conversations about, okay, what are we going to do about it? And some people stood up and said, my dad's home was burned out. I grew up homeless. I had to move away to Prince George. So one thing that we're going to do if we ever do it is I get my farm back. And other people stood up and said, we can't really rebuild history. We've got to think about the future. And that kind of crisis took 2 years to resolve while people talked about, okay, what would we do if we could do something? The province and all these MLAs, they figured out that there was something going on here, and people were pretty grumpy, and they started sending all these civil servants here to say, okay, what would it take to make this conversation end? How about if we give you some glass beads and some... How about a music festival? Or what do we have to do? And these are good people. They weren't evil people. They were doing what they've always done to stop the conversation between... But it didn't stop, because it was like, by now it's like a steamroller, and it was going on, and everybody was talking about it. The next person I want to nominate for hero of that time, besides Zena Patmos, is a guy named Bill King. You guys remember Bill King? Yeah. Bill King lives in Fruitvale now. Once upon a time, he was Minister of Labor. He was my MLA in the Spokane. He lived in Revelstoke. And now he's a senior guy, like an older fellow, lots of authority, and still just as tough as nails. And so the civil servants failed to resolve the deal for glass beads, and so the premier comes out, and there's a meeting going on, and this goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and finally the premier says, all right, well, what would it take to resolve this issue? And I was scared. And I think most of the people in the room were scared, because we didn't want to tell the premier what we thought, because it's risky. And Bill King says, well, Mike, I'd say about $500 million might do it. And that's what happened. After Bill spoke those words, a bunch of things took place, which led to the creation of an institution that had never existed before. One person in the legislature voted against it. He was a nice guy, but he happened to be called a social creditor, and so his history was rooted in the fact that the people were treated just fair and there is no issue. But the province of British Columbia created an institution called the Columbia Basin Trust and gave it $250 million. And it created an institution called Columbia Power Corporation. Really pissed off the executives of Hydro. A brand new Crown corporation called Columbia Power and gave it $250 million. And in the negotiations, because I remember Cominco was in a bit of a jam, the province negotiated with Cominco to take away or transfer or sell their power rights at the Bonita Dam. The province and the trust negotiated to buy outright the Brilliant Dam. You aren't going to Castlegar and you see on the left all that water, you own it. And the drone in Castlegar that had never made a nickel for anybody and was on call to the Army Corps of Engineers, Hydro said, oh, you can't touch our dam. So the trust and Columbia Power Corporation built a ditch next to it. and put a turbine at the end of the ditch. Finished it a year ahead of time and began making money almost before Hydro woke up. You now own, well, you're just about done. When's one need to finish? 25?
15.
In 2015, according to this gentleman who's presently building it, you will own 3 operating plants on the river. Now, this is important to think about. When Bill King said about $500 million ought to do it, Mike, that was a dollar figure. But in the discussions that followed the dollar figure, the people said, actually, we don't want the money. You give us that much money, it'd be like a steak hitting the table in a food bank, like in starving people. Like, we don't want the money. What we want is a piece of the resource. We want to be at the table. We want to be able to talk about how the river gets managed. Hydro, Bonneville, Army Corps of Engineers, we want to be, like, all these people can have that side of the table. We want to be on the other side, or at least sitting against the wall. We don't want money. We want to be part, and so that's, and that is the reason why you own dams instead of a bank account. It's a beautiful thing. British Columbia owns all these trees. It's like a community forest, right? Instead of saying, Kootenay Forest Products owns the trees, it's you. So the people who formed the trust decided to take their money and invest it in people like Brendan working to build power so that you would have power and your grandchildren would have power, and on till the end there would be power. Because it kind of means that we have to grow up. We don't just get to, like I remember when they, you guys remember when they closed the university in Nelson? I went with a bunch of people and my children and the mayor of Nelson, Mr. Madrigal, and we took a bus to Victoria. We had a demonstration to try to stop it from closing the university. And what was the symbol that we carried at the demonstration? We carried light bulbs. We said, if you're not nice to us, we'll shut off your power. And of course, we lost. But it's entrenched that that is whatever power we have. But instead of railing against the darkness, the people who formed the trust said, we want to be part of the deal. We will grow up and learn to manage the river instead of just railing against our history. I would say that's the end of Act 2. Since that time, we have begun to learn. Is there something to put in my mouth? Since that time, we've begun to learn how to try to change those deserts, the dead biology of those reservoirs, into something alive again. I don't know if you know this, but people all over the world are coming to Kootenay to study what it is you're doing. Dumping fertilizer into the lake to grow plankton, to feed to little fish, to feed to, you know, giant trout. In Kootenay. And since that time, the trust has begun to support things like what you're doing right at this minute. Like, how weird is that? Let's go fund a storyteller. Oh, that's a good idea. and the Windlaw ball field. Like, the trust gives some money and you get to play soccer. You know, like, stuff is happening. A little quiet. That never happened before. I think Act 3 starts from a pretty good place in that some of the rancor has been diminished and some of the conversation carries on. And we're no longer saying, well, we'll turn off the lights. In fact, you know what? We figured out you can't turn off the lights. If you stop the water, it would flood us. Darn! It took years to figure that out. Okay, here's the drill. Have I got any time? What is it?
About 5 minutes.
Okay. The 60 years of the original treaty. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you something. The Crown gave us pretty much what Bill asked for, $500 million. But don't feel sorry for the Crown. The second 30 years of Downstream Benefits, instead of $264 million, it turned into $8 billion. So you got a piece of the action, but not the action, right? This is 2013, you know, 2014, 24, okay, go 1964, what's the math? Like, the treaty said it will run for 60 years. And either country can move to abrogate the treaty or renegotiate the treaty or re-sign the treaty after 50 years. So you are months away from the day when Act 3 begins. 2014, somebody will say something somewhere and something's going to happen. About what are we going to do about the second 60 years? Do you want the treaty? Is the treaty a good thing or is it a terrible thing? We just want to stop, take all the dams down. Don't be thinking you're going to have salmon back by taking the dams down. There's 400 of those things south of the border. There are smart people who say the world wars of the future will be over water. This is, when the treaty was signed, they'd never sent that rocket up and taken pictures of the planet. They didn't know it was finite. We didn't understand the word ecology. We had never heard of climate change. We thought making jobs and dams and factories and aluminum and stuff like that was a good idea. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things on people's minds. There are smart people who think that the wars of the future will be fought over water. Because the world doesn't look, it ain't going to work anymore. The rivers that run across Europe and the rivers that run across North Africa and everybody shares, they're going to start looking like the Columbia where there's nothing but mud where it enters Mexico. Well, I think what's necessary is for somebody in the world to figure out how to negotiate over a natural resource without trying to kill the other guy. What I think would be cool if Act 3 was not run by lawyers and trade negotiators and politicians, but by regular people, maybe even kids who live there saying, what does this living thing need? What do we all need? How do we get a beach back in August when the children are out of school? How do we get fish back? How do we manage this thing so that you can have irrigation, but I can still sell my crops and you don't undercut my prices? Like there is a, what do we do about the First Nations that we declared extinct when we built the dam? There is a million things we ought to fix. And if the second 30 years in Canada was worth $8 billion, that means the price of the United States for that second 30 years was $16 billion. There is a whack of cash on the table. There's enough cash on the table to start and do it all over again. And either premiers and prime ministers and presidents and governors are going to decide they need that cash to save your taxes, or people on both sides, Roma's side and Gretchen's side, could negotiate some different kind of deal. And then in North Africa, there'd be an example to look at. We wouldn't have to necessarily use AK-47s to solve the future's problems. Thanks a lot.